So in the Garden of Eden, there's Adam and Eve, right? The primordial human beings. And there's a walled garden. That's paradise. Paradise means walled garden. And Eden means well-watered place. And so there's this idea that the proper habitat of human beings is an amalgam of social structure and nature. And that's exactly right, because that's what we live in, right? We never live in nature. And we never live in society. We live in an amalgam of society and nature. That's the human environment. So it's a walled garden. All right? And so it's a productive, well-watered place where we could thrive. It's safe, and it's ruled over by a father figure in this particular story. And that's like you could think about that as the spirit of civilization. That's at least one way of considering it. So, well, there's a snake in the garden, and it's there unbeknownst to God, roughly speaking. Although he knows everything, so I guess he probably knows about the snake too. And he tells Adam and Eve not to interact with it. Fine, and they do, and the snake wakes them up, right? Because when they interact with the snake, they're given a fruit that opens their eyes and makes them aware that they're naked and vulnerable, and then dooms them to work. Well, I'll tell you the whole story much later in the course, but I want to give you an overview of it now. But then there's this really strange idea that developed over the course of the development of not only Christianity, but Judaism and a number of other religions that fed into the mainstream of Christian ideas, including Zoroastrianism. There's an idea that emerged across a very long period of time, that the snake in the garden was the same as Satan, the source of all evil. And I've been trying to figure out for the longest period of time, why in the world the manifestation of what's essentially a representation of a predator, so that's this snake, and you know, the snake is associated with trees. Well, yes, the reason for that in all likelihood is that we dwelt in trees. Right, and snakes like trees, and they're around trees, and they can climb trees, and the snake was a typical predator on our ancient relatives. And so that's fine. So you can see that representation makes perfect sense. There's predators that lurk in the garden. Yes, obviously. If you interact with them, they wake you up. Well, they better wake you up, because if they don't wake you up when you interact with them, then you get eaten. So it's probably just as well to wake up, even though there's painful consequences associated with becoming conscious. And that manifests itself immediately in the story of Adam and Eve. But then there's this weird association. It's very undeveloped in the biblical stories that are part and parcel of this line of thinking. It was more like a consequence of a cloud of mythological stories that surrounded it. But the reason for that, I think, is that imagine that what human beings were trying to puzzle out was the nature of the predator. Okay, so on one level of analysis, the predator is the thing that slinks along the ground and that threatens you. And also it's the thing that's your mortal enemy and that wakes you up. But then that's one conceptualization of predator. And fair enough, you can identify it and you can take precautionary measures. But a better conceptualization of predator might be, where does it come from? Let's say it's a snake. Well, there's a lair of snakes somewhere. And so if we want to get rid of the snake, we shouldn't be conceptualizing it as a snake. We should be conceptualizing it as one manifestation of a lair of snakes, and what we should do is go down, follow the damn snake wherever it goes, and find its lair and wipe out all of the snakes. And that's a more abstract representation, right? It's not predator anymore. It's the source of predation. And so if you want to solve the predator problem permanently, you don't kill the snake. You get rid of all the snakes. Okay, so fine. So, and people are pretty damn good at that. And that's why you have stories of people like St. Patrick, who chased all the snakes out of Ireland. And all sorts of saints were snake eradication saints. And, well, there's a variety of reasons for that. But then you might think, okay, well, the worst predator is the lair of snakes, right? But then you might think, well, wait a minute. The worst predator isn't the lair of snakes. Maybe the worst predator is the enemies that come to attack us. And those are human enemies. And so what we do is we defend ourselves against the human enemies. We put walls around our cities. We fortify our land. And we defend ourselves against the evil that's lurking in other people's hearts. And so that's like a higher order snake. And then we build these walls around us. And what's inside gets larger and larger and larger. And then what happens is the snakes start popping up inside the cities. Because, you know, we've pushed all the... We've protected ourselves from all the evil that lurks outside, but we've now created a space where that evil can manifest itself inside. So there's criminals inside the city, and there's people who want to bring you down, and there's malevolence within the city, not only outside. So then there's the problem of the snake that's closer to you. And then there's the ultimate problem, which is the snake that lives in your heart. Right? And that's each individual's capacity for evil. And then that was conceptualized as a transcendent spirit. Right? So that's the spirit of Satan, who's the adversary of the hero. The adversary of the hero. And that's why there's an association between the snake in the garden and this great series of mythologies about the existence of evil itself. It's a consequence of our continued capacity to abstract. We started using the predator detection system to detect snakes and maybe predatory cats and maybe birds of prey and all that, but that didn't solve the bloody problem. Because just because you hid from the predatory bird today didn't mean the bloody thing wasn't going to be back tomorrow. And tomorrow starts to matter as you get smarter. And then once you're on that pathway and you're starting to think abstractly about the predator, the nature of what constitutes the predator starts to become, because you're trying to solve it across all situations simultaneously, it starts to become very much more abstract, and it ends up being something like a personality, like an eternal personality, and an eternal personality that has its effect on everyone all the time. So it's so interesting to see those ideas, because they basically evolved. People did not understand those ideas as they produced them. Right? It was all put forward in a massive mythological context, in a rich, storied context. And the stories were as conscious as the information got. It was never articulated past the level of story. So, remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. So, there's the distribution of scores. Now, that's dismal. That's a dismal thing to look at. You have to understand that. Why? Look at this. 0. Right? The median person has not done anything creative ever in their life with anything on any dimension. Right. It's really important to know that. And then you have these horrible people out here. Right? They do everything. They do everything. Price's law. Here's Price's law. This is something to hammer into your heart. The square root of the number of people in a domain do 50% of the work. Okay, so let's go through that. You have 10 employees. 3 of them do half the work. Makes sense. That's reasonable. You have 100 employees. 10 of them do half the work. Well, that's a problem. So the other 90% are doing the other half. Who cares about them? You have 10,000 employees. 100 of them do half the work. Right, so here's a nasty little law. As your company grows, incompetence grows exponentially and competence grows linearly. Got it? Right? Because with 10, it's 3 who are doing half the work, but at 10,000, it's 100 that are doing half the work. So 9,900 of your employees are doing as much as the best 100. You might not even know who the best 100 are, but probably they know. And maybe their peers know too. And so one of the things that's really interesting when big companies start to shake, which means maybe they've had a bad quarter or 2 bad quarters, and the stock price starts to tip down, and the hot people who have options are not very happy about that, and maybe they start to announce layoffs, all the 100 people who have opportunities leave. And they're the ones who were doing half the work. So boy, that puts your company in a pretty rough situation, because now you've got the 9,900 people left over who were only doing half the work. And the next time you announce layoffs, the next most productive 100 leave. And so then you're left with nobody who's productive and a massive overhead payroll. Price's law. You can look that up. De Sola Price. De Sola Price is a guy who was looking at scientific productivity. And one of the things he found was, when he was looking at PhD students, is that the median number of publications for a PhD graduate when he did his work, which was in the early 60s, was 1. Okay? Half as many had 2. Half as many as that had 3. Half as many as that had 4. It's a real step down. And one of the corollaries of that is that there's a certain number of people who are hyper-productive. And that's these people out here. And if you were graphing the distribution, let's say you graphed how many people in a population of 300 had $10,000 in a savings account. It would look very much like this. Some of them would have, or some of them would, most people would have like no savings whatsoever. The median person would have no savings whatsoever. And then you go up here where the 1% is, they have all the money. But the thing you want to understand about that 1% issue that you always hear about is that it applies in every single realm where there's difference in creative production. Every realm. Doesn't matter. Number of records produced, number of records sold, number of compositions written. So here's an example. 5 composers produce the music that occupies 50% of the classical repertoire, right? Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Mozart, that's right, those 5. Okay, so here's something cool. So you take all the music those people wrote. 5% of the music all those people wrote occupies 50% of the music of their writing that's played. So not only do almost all the composers never get a listen, but even among the composers who do get a listen, almost none of their music ever gets played. So then that's another example of this Price's law of scaling. So it applies to all sorts of things, like number of hockey goals scored is also distributed this way. Number of basketballs successfully put through the hoop follows the same distribution. Size of cities follows the same distribution. It's a weird law, and you can think about it in part. Why does this happen? Well, imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. What happens? Everybody has the same amount of money to begin with, right? So then you start playing. It's basically a random game. Well, some people start to win a bit, and some people start to lose a bit. And then if you win, the probability that you'll keep winning starts to increase. And if you lose, your vulnerability increases as you lose. And then maybe you've got, say, 6 people playing Monopoly. Soon one person has 0. What happens when they have 0? They're out of the game. So 0 is a weird number, because when you hit 0, you're out of the game. So then if you keep playing, people start to stack up at 0, right? What happens at the end of the game? One person has all the property and all the money, and everyone else has none. Right, that's what happens if you play an iterated trading game to its final conclusion. And that's part of the law, in a sense, that's underlying this kind of distribution. So it's not a consequence necessarily of structural inequality. It's built into the system at a deeper level than that. So, people talk about all the time about how unfair it is that the 1% of the population has the vast amount of the money, and 1% of the 1% has most of that money, and 1% of the 1% of the 1% has most of that money. But it is it's an inevitable conclusion of iterated trading games, and we don't know how to fight it. We don't know how to take from the people who have and move it to the bottom without it instantly moving back up to the top. Different people, maybe, but still back up to the top. Because even the 1% churns a lot. Like, I think you have a 10% chance, if I remember correctly, you have a 10% chance of being in the top 1% for at least 1 year of your life, and a 40% chance of being in the top 10% for at least 1 year in your life. That's in Canada and the US. It's less so in Europe. So there's a fair bit of churning at the top end. It's not the same people all the time who have the money, but it is a tiny fraction of the people all the time who have all the money.